I have given Psalm 66 a rather strange title for a psalm, a model for interethnic evangelism. But this could be of great interest to those who have a heart for cross-cultural evangelism, especially when it is with those who are recovering from trauma. And notice that this Psalm 66 ministry is facilitated by a trauma survivor. Now, the psalm is in the form of a hymn, a teaching hymn. Think of Charles Wesley's hymns that backed up the preaching of his brother John Wesley in the 17th century and gave us many stirring hymns that we still sing. Like Charles Wesley, the psalmist summarises the teaching they had given in a memorable form that they could sing about in their everyday lives. Then and now, this is a brilliant way of reinforcing the teaching given. I never thought this was what the psalm was about when I started this study. So let me go through how I uncovered this insight. I will follow a model I have developed that examines the poetic structure and the circumstances about when the psalm was written, as best can be discovered. My findings are recorded on a website. On this journey of discovery, we will explore this psalm that in Hebrew is set out in 5 stanzas. Psalm 66 appears to be entirely about praise and thanksgiving, and it starts with the call to all the earth to praise God. Earth refers to the physical world, but here it is used metaphorically for earth dwellers, the people who lived in the world he knew or had heard of. The psalmist seems to assume that all will respond readily and positively, for already all the earth bows down and they sing praise. It's not that they will do this, they are already worshipping God. He provides evidence for what God has done to warrant this worship by referring to the exodus from Egypt, especially the miraculous escape through the sea, that's the Red Sea, and then through the waters, that refers to the crossing of the River Jordan. A certain call is made in stanza 3 to the peoples. They seem to be distinctly different from all the earth of verse 1. This stanza is not addressed to you, which is unwritten in English grammar as in stanzas 1 and 2, but is about us, we, and our. That implies that the psalmist feels a sense of oneness with these peoples. It seems they were united by their experiences of suffering. They had been traumatized, but their lives had been preserved. They had had similar experiences that was like being in some sort of prison and being used as slave labour. And then, you let men ride over our heads sounds like a battlefield experience of defeat. And we went through fire and water perhaps refers to the destruction of their homes and dangerous travel conditions. Whatever could this refer to? I've checked through the Old Testament records, and these descriptions seem to refer to the people's experiences after the Assyrian Empire swept to power. The story is recounted in 2 Kings 17, and we read, in the 9th year of Hosea, who was the king of Israel, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to some towns in Assyria that were not far from the capital, Nineveh. The king of Assyria then brought people from Babylon and other towns and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. Now, communicating with these different ethnic groups would not have been a problem. Many would know Aramaic, the language of Assyria, for it had for 200 years been widely used in trade and international communication throughout the Middle East. When they first lived there, they did not worship Yahweh. So he, that's Yahweh, sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, "The people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He sent lions among them, which are killing them off, because the people do not know what he requires." Then the king of Assyria gave this order: "Have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires." So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship Yahweh. How about that? Do you see how it links with Psalm 66? I think it's likely that Psalm 66 was written by this priest, or at least someone associated with him. He came to live in Bethel, and that was only 15 miles from Jerusalem. And the significance of that will become apparent. So, the peoples appear to be these immigrants from Babylonia and Assyria, as well as any remnant of the local Jewish population. The psalmist, possibly the priest who settled in Bethel, identified with their experiences, and he refers to us. They were together in this land and had had somewhat similar traumatic experiences of being oppressed. And he had found a point of contact, a mutual experience, a mutual need. But then the fourth stanza changes again, as this section is very personal. As I, me, and my are used. That's understandable, as in this section the psalmist describes his response to the awesome God that is the focus of worship of the earth and the peoples. And such a God rightfully demands individual commitment from his worshippers. But notice, as he focuses on himself, he links in with his listeners. Come and listen, all you who fear God. Now, who could this be referring to? He seems to have a closer link to them than to the earth or even the peoples. And why call them God-fearers? We'll come back to this question. My working title or theme, it had been a worldwide call to worship that requires a personal response. But there's something wrong about this. Have you noticed the mismatch? For the psalmist makes a worldwide call to worship that requires a personal response. But that does not fit with people who have turned away from Yahweh and worshipped other gods, even to the extent of murdering their own children in sacrifices. And then the immigrants continued to worship their own gods. Nothing is said here about godly worship and evangelism. But I have an hypothesis that I believe is worth investigating. This is that in all the backsliding and apostasy there was in the nation, one man at least remained faithful to Yahweh, and he saw the opportunity to lead others to know their God. Psalm 66 describes how he went about this task. However, I actually don't think he was alone. There's some evidence that is worth noticing. Firstly, I'd like to take your attention to an event that happened 130 years earlier when Elijah was a prophet. And he had this enormous battle with the priests of Baal. And he won, if we can put it like that. But then he ran for fear of his life, because King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, they wanted him dead. He was depressed. He was despondent. He felt very alone. He thought he was the only one who had stood against Baal and the Baal priests. But as he troubled about this, Yahweh spoke to him. I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. That was 130 years before. But it makes me wonder whether in other generations, and perhaps in every generation, in the middle of all the backsliding and apostasy, there may well have been a number of people who remain faithful to Yahweh. There's some other evidence about this too in some of the other Psalms. Some of the Psalms are clearly based in this period in Israel's life when the account of it in Kings and Chronicles, etc., is all about backsliding and apostasy. But the Psalms have a rich spiritual life and interest that doesn't match with that sort of apostasy. So I think there may well have been other godly people who would work with this priest. And then we have another evidence, and I hold it in my hand. This is my Bible. And in my Bible, I read these Psalms. I read the story of the backsliding and apostasy of the nation. How did it come to be in my hands thousands of years later? Okay, God was in control, absolutely. But God works through people. And I think there must have been people in every generation who wrote these Psalms, who recorded the stories about what was happening, who passed them on. They preserved them, they shared them, they talked about them, they used them. And that's where our Bible came from these godly people who were devoted to Yahweh and his teaching. So my hypothesis is that Psalm 66 is based on this evangelistic campaign. It's in the form of a hymn that was written to enable the converts to be reminded of their newfound faith and equip them to grow spiritually. Godly people who had experienced God's comfort and care through their own experiences of trauma shared what they had learned with their new neighbours. So let's just re-examine Psalm 66 to see what evidence there is that might support this hypothesis. And if it all holds together, it will provide new insights into the Old Testament narrative. To start at the beginning, the psalmist confidently assumes that the whole earth will be aware of God's awesome power, and everyone expresses their appreciation in worship that is shown in obeisance and communal sung praise. Now, this is hyperbole. It's not a statement of fact. It's poetic, it's not scientific language, and he uses a figure of speech that we are familiar with to promote the point that belief in an overarching power in the world is a common, even a universal feature of humankind's understanding of the world. In ancient times, everybody worshipped God. There was a general understanding that there was a power over and beyond what they could see and experience that was understood to be in control. This is akin to the sense many people, and not just Christians, have when they spend time in the natural world, out in the countryside or at sea. The beauty, the immensity, the grandeur, the power. There has to be a cause behind it all. So a belief in God as the ultimate reason is very common, both in ancient times and in the present. And the psalmist speaks into that situation. He ignores the overlays of alternative religious beliefs. Instead, he acknowledges and then builds on that innate belief in a higher power that is common and still is. The psalmist reminds them of stories they would have heard of his own people's experience of God's massive rescue from Egyptian slavery. The psalmist takes this as evidence that God rules forever and that he watches the nations, so all should take note and respond appropriately. He expresses this negatively when he says, "Let not the rebellious rise up against him." The psalmist addresses the nations he knew of and assumes they would know what he was talking about. The escape from Egypt had taken place about 500 years previously. Life changed inordinately slowly in ancient times, so it was quite reasonable to expect that these events would have been known. Yahweh, the God they worshipped, was not a tribal god, as the king of Assyria had said. The psalmist believed this was a warning to the nations, the earth dwellers, to respect God and not rebel against him. And then in stanza 3, the psalmist turns from the beliefs of the worldwide community to their own multicultural group who were now united, living together in their new land. This relates to what we read in 2 Kings 17. For after Assyria, the dominant nation of the time that was about the size of Western Europe, overran the northern kingdom Israel and partly controlled the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, together they were a tiny part of the empire, about 100 miles long and 50 miles wide, about the size of Wales. That was in 732 BC. And after that, the Jewish population, who were forcibly driven out and dispatched to other parts of the empire near Nineveh, that was 600 miles away. And they were replaced with people who also were forcibly made to leave their own homeland, mainly from around Babylon, and that was 800 miles away. They would have been horrendous journeys, probably all on foot, so taking many months. And it's interesting that the Assyrians encouraged the immigrants to adopt Jewish religious practices, but were apparently not very successful. That's not surprising, as the Jews were already compromising their faith by worshipping other gods, and this included the Jews from Judah, whom they would meet on visits to the temple in Jerusalem, 15 miles away from Bethel. And so in stanza 3, he boldly refers to our God. And the evidence given for this is all about what God has done for us, suggesting he acknowledges their part in the community and is referring to the traumatic experiences they all had had, and not only referring to his own Jewish culture. It was as if they'd experienced forced manual labour. They had been overridden on the battlefield and been through fire and water that emphasises the overwhelming forces they had survived. there's no clue about exactly what is referred to. They could well be very real experiences that some of the peoples have actually experienced, but the minimal details mean that equally they could be metaphors that singers and readers would recognize as connecting with the descriptions of their own sufferings, with the sort of caveat, it felt as if. And this is how metaphors work. They create images in our minds that link both with our experiences and our emotional and behavioural reactions to them. And now, through this psalm, the individual people groups with their diverse experiences were linked as they were living together in the land, either as forced refugees or those who had survived the devastation of being conquered. And the psalmist uses this communication technique to introduce his community to a richer awareness of the God he worshipped. The psalmist had an interesting way of describing what had happened. He regarded their experience as occasions when God tested them. This is one of the many occasions when Scripture states that God is responsible for our suffering. It does not sit comfortably with some beliefs about God being compassionate, loving, and our Saviour. However, if God is God, and so is the ultimate authority and power, logically, he has to be the ultimate responsible person. Rather than giving rise to cries of anguish, shock, or disgust, this should actually engender peace of mind, relief, and comfort. For if God is God and he is in control, bad things happening are not random events, nor due to rampant evil. God is God and he is in control. We can rest, therefore, in the assurance that God's promise is, I will never leave you nor forsake you. God is compassionate and caring. He joins us in our suffering and hardship with his grace, mercy, and presence, and sometimes with rescue. We need to focus on that, on what Yahweh does, and not on our sufferings, for that is when God can appear to be distant and uncaring. This is a powerful message, as relevant today as it was when Psalm 66 was written. Notice that in this stanza, the psalmist addresses his multi-ethnic community initially, but after the first two lines, he changes to addressing God on their behalf. In a few carefully chosen words, he pulls them together and unites them in accepting God's role in their lives. You, O God, tested us. You brought us. You let men ride over our heads. You brought us to a place of abundance. There's no intellectual argument. Instead, the psalmist builds on their innate belief in God, reminds them of God's role in his nation's history, and then speaks about their personal experiences of suffering and God's role in bringing them through. That leads to the final line about their current situation. They were living in a place of abundance. The land was fertile. There were vacant homes, farms and vineyards to occupy, and even towns that were sparsely populated at most. A place of abundance sounds like a good description of what they were experiencing. So stanza 2 was addressed to you. Stanza 3 is about us. And when we turn to stanza 4, it is about me. Stanza 4 is about the psalmist's personal response to these calls to worship, and it's arranged differently to the other stanzas. The main point is in the centre, in which he appeals to his listeners to hear his personal testimony, with the implication that he wants them to follow his example. This time he addresses his audience as all you who fear God. This description suggests the psalmist has narrowed his remarks to those who have responded to his call to the peoples. The psalmist still has something to teach his new converts and to remind his group of restored believers. In the first part of this stanza, he describes how he outwardly and publicly expressed his worship. And in the second parallel part, he describes his inner private response. This is how God-fearers should express your faith, the psalmist teaches. Do what I do. This was the Alpha course, if you like, for new believers of his day. He starts, I will come to your temple with burnt offerings and fulfill my vows to you. That's expressing his thankfulness and commitment to God in attending the temple to make burnt offerings. And this was a personal choice that would fulfill my vows. The idea of expressing worship in the use of animal sacrifices would be familiar to those he was addressing, as this was the invariable practice of all religions. Animals had to be the best, perfectly formed and the firstborn. So sacrifices had to be made, perhaps even before a second birth was accomplished, to enable the farmer to develop his herd. This is teaching that worship is a priority and it is costly. Next, he reflects on his vow to live for God when he was in trouble. Vows my lips promised and my mouth spoke when I was in trouble, he said. That was a vow he'd made publicly, and such vows have to be kept, whatever the cost. And the lesson here is that this is a serious business. No one messes about with Yahweh, although that name is still unspoken. We've got to be serious about our faith in Jesus and our worship of Yahweh. Then he discloses his plan to express his worship expansively and publicly by offering numerous animals. I will sacrifice fat animals, they were the best, to you, and an offering of rams. I will offer bulls and goats. Actually, only one animal was ever required in the fulfillment of a vow. So this is hyperbole, in which he expresses his thankfulness exuberantly. And the lesson here is that worshipping Yahweh is not a chore or an optional extra, and it's always a communal activity. These 3 points that are about how he publicly expressed his worship are paralleled by another 3 points that develop the first ones but address them from an inner and a personal perspective. So, in Scripture, praise is always expressed verbally. There's rarely any praying silently or praying in your mind. So when the psalmist says, I cried out to him with my mouth, his praise was on my tongue, he wants us to know his verbal expression is more than ordinary speech. It's loud, exuberant, expansive, to match his animal sacrifices. And it's personal. It comes from within, from his heart. And that teaches us that Yahweh knows our hearts. We cannot deceive him. Though worship is a communal activity, it means very little unless we are all participating from our own inner convictions. Next he says, if I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. And he confesses how he expressed his commitment, not only verbally, but by leading a godly life. This is not about sinning in itself. We all do that. But it's about cherishing sin. The verb translated cherish is a common word that usually is shown as seen. It's as if the psalmist has been examining his heart to see if sin was lurking there, ready to be fed and developed into openly sinful behaviour. So the lesson here is that our behaviour must express our worship as well as our words. Verbal worship and the public expression of worship has to be matched by godly behaviour. that reflects a godly attitude. Finally, but God has surely listened and heard my voice in prayer, he expresses his sense of assurance that God has accepted him. That is as crucial for Old Testament believers as it is for followers of Jesus. How can we ever know that our worship has been accepted is the worry for worshippers of any God. The best most can have is a vague hope. But many live in despair and either give up religious practices, go through the motions, or devote their lives by any means to do what will achieve their goals of nirvana, karma, paradise, or heaven. He does not explain how he knows that. He just does. And he's confident that others can experience that assurance too. And that's so like what it is for us. We sense a change in our innermost being. We want to worship. We want to live God-honouring lives. We are distressed if we let God down by sinning, and we desperately want to put right whatever wrong we've done. We've no problem, therefore, in accepting the psalmist's claim that God has surely listened and heard my voice, as that's our experience. So lesson 6 is assurance is a secret strength of believers. And as we grow in our knowledge of God and his ways, we may also grow in confidence and determination to follow in God's ways ever more closely. This is not what we normally have on a modern day Alpha course. There's nothing about Bible reading or prayer, for example, but everything about worship and putting Yahweh first. The psalmist ends with stanza 5, a single line that praises God for answered prayer that he takes to be a feature of his love. And that word used denotes kindness, love, loyalty, and mercy. This assurance is a further reason for praise. Stanza 5 is expressed personally, but it's not an expression of selfishness. For as well as bringing the psalm to its conclusion and paralleling stanza 1, it also is linked with stanza 4, where he shares his personal experience of Yahweh as an example for his new converts to follow. And so Psalm 66 comes to a close. It is, as in my first impressions, all about worship, but it is set in the form of a teaching hymn to act as a prompt to help both new and revived believers give Yahweh his rightful place in their lives. Therefore, it could well be a model we can follow in our own attempts to reach the world and our particular part of the world for Jesus. There are more details of Psalm 66 in the Psalm Insights website.